Hi guys, welcome back aboard for this second episode of the Ask Andrew channel on batteries and battery switches. Let's imagine firing down the lake on a beautiful summer day. The sun is shining, the radio is playing, you find a great secluded spot to anchor. You do so. You enjoy fishing and swimming, and drinks are flowing. Radio is playing, everything is great. The sun begins to set, you pull up anchor, you're about to head back to dock. You turn the key to start the engine, and the engine won't start. Your battery has died, being drained by the lights, the plug-in cooler, the bilge pump, all running all day long. The problem becomes even greater when we consider that we only typically use boats on the weekend, or they're left for long periods of time in between usage, and electronic devices are still on. Things like bilge pumps and alarms are continually running or operable even when the boat isn't being charged back up, and those are continually draining that battery. This video will look at battery switches, which will allow you to control the way that power is used aboard, stopping this from happening to you in the future. Let's back way up and look how this works in a way that's a bit more familiar to all of us, which is in a car. So cars are pretty simple. They work the same way essentially that small boats do, in that you turn the key, the battery, which I'll spin around here and show you, will provide power to the engine, which allows the engine to start. When the engine is running, the alternator is being turned, and the alternator is really giving power to charge that battery back up. So here's under the hood of the truck. You can see an engine here in the center, and off to one side is the battery, which is going to give power to the engine to allow it to start, but also will allow you to power all the electronics inside, like your radio and lights and so on. I've quickly just attached a multimeter here to show what the engine looks like on and off. So right now the battery's at rest, nothing's on, and you can see above the multimeter that the battery is reading at 12.33 volts. I'm now going to start the engine, and we can see what the alternator does to change that voltage in the battery. So here the engine is running, and the multimeter is now reading 14.65 volts. You can see the alternator is keeping it at that rate, even though inside the truck the radio is running, the lights are on, the heater is running, all those things. So the battery is being used to power those appliances, yet the battery is staying the same voltage because the alternator is keeping up with the use of the battery. So same thing goes with a small boat. As long as the boat is running, the battery is going to keep up with any use of the electronics aboard, any lights, your horn, your radio, and so on. As long as that engine is running, the battery is going to stay topped up, and you can keep using all those electronics aboard. The problem really becomes when you turn that engine off. So if you're off for a long period of time, if you're fishing, swimming, the sails are up on a sailboat, any of those things, the battery is going to start to get drained without having anything to top the battery back up again by the engine running. So here's where we start to really steer away from the use of batteries in a car. We start to add extra batteries, different battery types and different battery arrangements to allow us to serve both purposes. We want to have a battery to start the engine, but we also want to have a battery available to us to power some of those low power electronics like bilge pumps, lights, radios, etc. A cranking or starting battery is designed to give one big burst of current to allow that engine to start turning. In a traditional lead acid style battery, there are many thick lead plates inside that casing. A deep cycle or a house battery is designed to give a much lower amount of current over a much greater period of time. In terms of construction, it's made with many more lead plates inside the casing, and they're very thin in size compared to the cranking battery. And to coordinate between the two, we use a battery switch. Battery switches come in two types. There's a simple on-off switch, or a secondary type, which allows you to choose between battery 1, which typically the starter battery, battery 2, which is the deep cycle or house battery, or all, which is drawing power from both. Here's an example of a very simple on-off switch. There's a second type of switch available, which has 4 positions: an off, battery 1, battery 2, and all. So let's go back to the example at the beginning of the video. Before you leave dock, turn the battery switch from off to battery number 1, which will allow the engine to draw only from the cranking or the starting battery. When you arrive at your destination, you drop your anchor, the engine gets turned off. At that point, turn the battery selector switch from battery number 1, which is the cranking or starting battery, to battery number 2, which is the deep cycle or house battery, which will allow you to run things like the radio, lights, and plug-in cooler. After a few hours in the sun, you're ready to head back to dock. You can then turn back to battery number 1 again, allowing the engine to start with no issues with having power available. So how do you know which is which? How do you know which is a starting battery versus a deep cycle? And how do you then choose which type or size of starting battery or which type and size of deep cycle to use? 2 different rating systems are used. Typically, a starting battery is measured by the cold cranking amps, and a deep cycle or house battery is measured using the amp hours. To make it really simple, the larger cold cranking amps will start a larger engine, smaller engines will require fewer cold cranking amps, and to determine how many cold cranking amps you need to start your engine, you'll need to reference the manufacturer's service manual. The much bigger question is, how many amp hours do you need to power all the electronics that you have on board, which becomes really complicated. I'm actually going to do a separate video on this at some point in the future to be able to calculate the number of watts that your appliances are drawing, and therefore how many amps and amp hours you need to power your boat. Again, suffice to say, if you need to have more amp hours available to power more electronics, you can always add more deep cycle batteries in parallel with each other, which will then double, triple, or quadruple the amount of amp hours that you have available to use. So on the outside, this battery looks just like a starting or cranking battery. This particular one is a deep cycle, and it has the advantage of having the label that says deep cycle on it. But the other way to determine or to confirm that it's a deep cycle is by looking at the label just here, and you can see it is rated in amp hours as opposed to cold cranking amps. If this label had a cold cranking amp rating, you would know that it is a starting or cranking battery. It's tempting to think that the reverse is true, that the alternator that's recharging those batteries is also dependent on that battery switch. Typically, a battery switch has a number of different selections. It has off, battery 1, battery 2, and all. Many people think that in order to charge both batteries at the same time, that the battery selector switch has to be turned to all for the alternator to charge both at the same time. When looking at the alternator charging system, it's actually an entirely different system than the battery switch. The battery switch is only used when drawing power from the batteries. On the opposite end, the recharging side, we use a device called a battery isolator, which looks kind of like that. There are many different styles of them, and its job really is to isolate the batteries so that they're not drawing power from each other, and also allows the alternator to charge both simultaneously. For single battery systems, like in a small boat or in a car, the battery is rated at a cold cranking amp rating because it's designed to tell you how many amps are available to start the engine, but it's also going to be drawing for your electronics in terms of amp hours. You may be curious how to convert from cold cranking amps to amp hours, and you do that by multiplying by a factor of 0.7. So a 650 CCA or cold cranking amp battery will yield 420 amp hours. Thanks so much for joining me here today, and please don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below. Thanks so much. I'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk about ethanol in fuels in episode 3 of Ask Andrew.